Queen Victoria, the woman who shaped an era. The wind whispered through the corridors of Kensington Palace on that spring morning of May 24, 1819, carrying with it the cries of a newborn child whose destiny would reshape the world. In a modest dining room converted for the occasion, a tiny girl entered existence, while outside, the great machinery of British royalty turned with indifferent precision. No fanfare announced her arrival. No prophets proclaimed her future. She was merely fifth in line to the throne, a princess born into the complicated politics of succession, a child who seemed destined for comfortable obscurity rather than the weight of a crown. The infant was christened Alexandrina Victoria, named for Tsar Alexander I of Russia and her mother. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of King George III, a man of middling prospects who had lived many years with a French mistress before marrying Victoria's mother in the desperate race among George III's sons to produce a legitimate heir. The race had begun after the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817, the only legitimate grandchild of the king, whose passing in childbirth had left the succession perilously uncertain. 8 months after Victoria's birth, death visited Kensington Palace. Prince Edward, weakened by pneumonia contracted during a seaside holiday, breathed his last in January 1820. The infant Victoria would never know her father, would never hear his voice or feel his embrace. 1 week later, her grandfather, King George III, died, and the succession shifted like sand beneath uncertain feet. Her uncle ascended as George IV, but he had no surviving children. Her other uncles, Frederick, Duke of York, and William, Duke of Clarence, stood between her and the throne, but they too had no legitimate offspring who survived infancy. The line of succession, once so certain, now hung by the thinnest of threads. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, found herself in a position of potential power but actual vulnerability. A German princess in a foreign court, widowed with a baby daughter and a daughter from a previous marriage, she became easy prey for manipulation. Enter John Conroy, an Irish soldier who had served as her late husband's equerry. Conroy saw opportunity in the Duchess's isolation and the princess's potential future. He convinced the Duchess that the royal dukes, whom he called the wicked uncles, posed a threat to young Victoria. Together, they devised what became known as the Kensington system. This system was designed, Conroy claimed, to protect Victoria, but its true purpose was control. The princess was never left alone. She shared her mother's bedroom every night until the day she became queen. She could not walk down a flight of stairs without someone holding her hand. She had no friends her own age, no companions except her older half-sister Theodore and the carefully selected adults around her. Every outing was supervised, every conversation monitored, every moment of her young life orchestrated to make her dependent on her mother and, by extension, on John Conroy. But there was one person who saw through Conroy's schemes and became Victoria's shield. Baroness Louise Lehzen, a German governess appointed before Victoria's birth, watched over the young princess with fierce devotion. Lehzen taught Victoria history, languages, and music. She encouraged the girl's love of reading and her talent for drawing. Most importantly, she taught Victoria to think for herself, to question, to resist the manipulation that swirled around her like fog. Victoria's childhood unfolded in the peculiar isolation of Kensington Palace. While other children of her age played freely, she studied under Lehzen's guidance, learning French, German, Italian, and Latin. She developed a passionate love for music and showed exceptional talent in drawing and painting. Her mother doted on her in some ways, taking her to the theatre and the seaside. Yet the shadow of Conroy's influence and the Kensington system made Victoria feel suffocated and controlled. Pension's The Turning Point came when Victoria was 10 years old. During a history lesson with Lehzen, the governess slipped an extra page into Victoria's history book, a page that showed the line of royal succession. Victoria studied it carefully, her young mind processing the implications. She looked up at Latson with dawning understanding in her eyes. The governess confirmed what the page revealed. Victoria would likely become queen. "I will be good," Victoria said, those 4 words carrying the weight of sudden understanding and solemn promise. It was the statement of a child, recognizing the enormity of what lay ahead, the burden that would one day rest upon her small shoulders. As Victoria grew older, the political maneuvering intensified. King George IV died in 1830, and William IV, Victoria's uncle, took the throne at age 64. William had several illegitimate children, but no surviving legitimate ones. Victoria, at 11 years old, became heir presumptive. The Regency Act of 1830 made provision for Victoria's mother to act as regent if William died while Victoria was still a minor, a prospect that terrified King William, who thoroughly distrusted the Duchess of Kent and her advisor, Conroy. The relationship between the king and the Duchess deteriorated into open hostility. Victoria, caught in the middle, began to understand the adult world of ambition and power that surrounded her. She witnessed scenes at court that shocked her. She saw her mother snubbed and insulted. She endured Conroy's increasing pressure to sign papers that would make him her private secretary when she became queen. Pressure she resisted with the strength Latson had helped her build. In 1835, when Victoria was 16, she fell seriously ill with typhoid fever. Confined to her room for 5 weeks, weak and vulnerable, she faced one of Conroy's most aggressive attempts at manipulation. He brought papers for her to sign, documents that would guarantee his position and power once she wore the crown. But even in her weakened state, Victoria refused. "I will not sign," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her will iron strong. Latson stood beside her, a silent sentinel, and together they weathered Conroy's anger. King William IV made his feelings abundantly clear. At a dinner celebrating his birthday in August 1836, with Victoria present and the Duchess seated nearby, the aging king rose to make a toast. His voice carried across the hushed room as he expressed his hope to live until Victoria reached 18, so that person, he said, gesturing toward the Duchess of Kent, would never have the opportunity to serve as regent. The humiliation burned, but Victoria sat with dignity beyond her years, her face composed even as the room erupted in shocked whispers. During this period, Victoria met someone who would change the course of her life. In May 1836, her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, orchestrated a visit from her German cousins, Ernst and Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Albert was exactly Victoria's age, born just 3 months earlier. When Victoria first saw him, she noted in her diary that he was extremely handsome, with beautiful nose and such a pretty mouth with delicate mustachios and slight but very slight whiskers. She found herself drawn to him in ways she had never experienced before. But at 16, she was not ready for marriage, and Albert soon departed. The months before Victoria's 18th birthday in May 1837 were filled with tension. King William IV's health declined rapidly. Everyone knew that the transition of power was imminent. Victoria prepared herself as best she could, studying statecraft, learning about the constitution, understanding the delicate balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority. She knew that when the moment came, she would have to stand alone, free at last from her mother's suffocating control and Conroy's manipulative grasp. On June 18, 1837, 2 days before Victoria's 18th birthday, King William IV hosted a ball at Windsor Castle. It was to be his last public appearance. Victoria attended, dancing until the early hours, unaware that within days, everything would change. The Awakening. A young queen rises. Recognize. The knock came at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 20th, 1837. Kensington Palace lay shrouded in the grey light of dawn as Victoria, awakened from sleep, descended the stairs in her dressing gown. For the first time in her life, She walked down those stairs alone, without anyone holding her hand, a small act of independence that carried immense symbolic weight. In the room below waited the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain, their faces grave with the news that would transform an 18-year-old girl into the sovereign of the most powerful nation on earth. "Your Majesty," they said, and with those two words, Victoria's childhood ended. King William IV had died at 2:12 that morning at Windsor Castle. The crown now rested upon her head. Reinforced the news with remarkable composure. She asked the gentleman to wait while she dressed, and when she returned, she was every inch a queen. At 11 o'clock that same morning, she held her first Privy Council meeting in the Red Saloon at Kensington Palace. More than 100 of Britain's most powerful men assembled, expecting to see a nervous girl overwhelmed by circumstance. Instead, they witnessed something remarkable. Pem Victoria entered the room alone. She had insisted on it, despite her mother's attempts to accompany her. This was her moment, her first act as queen, and she would face it without anyone standing between her and her ministers. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, yet she commanded the room with a presence that belied her youth. Charles Greville, the diarist who attended the council, later wrote that she displayed perfect calmness and self-possession, and that her manner was very graceful and engaging. The Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, observed her with approval, recognizing in this young queen a spirit of determination and strength. Victoria read her declaration in a clear, steady voice. She swore to uphold the Constitution and protect the Church of England. She looked each member of the council in the eye, establishing from that first moment that she was not a figurehead to be managed, but a monarch who would rule with intelligence and purpose. That first day set the tone for what followed. Victoria immediately moved to establish her independence. She ordered her bed removed from her mother's room and placed in her own private chamber. For the first time in 18 years, she would sleep alone, free from constant surveillance. She refused to appoint John Conroy to any position in her household, a rejection that sent him into a rage but freed her from his malign influence. She asked Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, to be her guide and mentor, and in Melbourne she found not a manipulator, but a genuine friend and teacher. Melbourne was 58 years old, a widower whose own life had been marked by scandal and sorrow. His wife had left him for Lord Byron, and his son had died young. In Victoria he found new purpose, and in him Victoria found a father figure and trusted advisor. They met almost daily, discussing politics, history, and the art of governance. Melbourne taught her to navigate the complex world of British politics, to understand the delicate balance between monarch and parliament, to know when to assert her authority and when to yield to constitutional convention. Those early days of Victoria's reign were marked by genuine joy. For the first time in her life, she experienced freedom. She went riding in the morning without supervision. She stayed up late playing cards with her ladies-in-waiting. She danced at balls until dawn. She laughed freely, spoke her mind, and revelled in her newfound independence. Her diary from this period sparkles with happiness. Page after page filled with exclamation points and underlined phrases expressing her delight in her new life. But monarchy brought challenges as well as freedoms. In 1839, Victoria found herself at the centre of a political crisis known as the Bedchamber Crisis. When Melbourne's government fell, the Queen was required to ask Sir Robert Peel, leader of the opposition Conservatives, to form a new government. Peel requested that Victoria replace some of her Whig ladies-in-waiting with Conservative ones, a reasonable request given the custom of the time. But Victoria, devoted to Melbourne and his Whigs, refused. She saw her household as her private domain, and she would not be told whom she could have around her. The crisis ended with Melbourne's return to power, but the incident revealed Victoria's strong will and her occasional stubborn refusal to compromise. It also demonstrated her youth and inexperience. A more seasoned monarch would have understood the necessity of such political accommodations, but at 20, Victoria still had much to learn about the art of constitutional monarchy. It was during this period of political tumult that Victoria's thoughts returned to her cousin Albert. In October 1839, 3 years after their first meeting, Albert and his brother Ernst visited Windsor Castle. When Victoria saw Albert again, she was astonished by how he had changed. The boy had become a man, and she found him even more handsome than she remembered. She wrote in her diary, with barely contained excitement about his appearance, his intellect, his gentle nature. Within days, Victoria knew what she wanted. As queen, she had to be the one to propose. On October 15, 1839, 5 days after Albert's arrival, Victoria summoned him to her room. Her hands trembled as she told him of her feelings and asked him to marry her. Albert accepted with joy, and Victoria's happiness overflowed. "How I will strive to make him feel as little as possible the great sacrifice he has made," she wrote, understanding that Albert was giving up his own life to become her consort. The young queen had found love, but she was not yet ready to share power. When Lord Melbourne suggested that marriage might ease the burden of her responsibilities, Victoria bristled. She was queen, and she would remain firmly in control. Albert would be her husband, but the crown was hers alone. The Heart's Conquest, Love and Albert. The wedding took place on February 10, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. It was a Monday, chosen because Victoria wanted to marry on a weekday rather than the traditional royal wedding day of Saturday night. For the first time in over a century, a royal wedding would take place in daylight hours, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, allowing thousands of Londoners to line the streets and catch a glimpse of the procession. Victoria wore white, a revolutionary choice in an era when brides typically wore rich colours like red, blue or gold. Her white satin and Honiton lace dress was designed to support British textile workers, with the silk woven in Spitalfields and the lace made in Devon. The dress was simple yet elegant, adorned with orange blossoms, which Albert had sent her as a symbol of his love. On her head, she wore a wreath of orange blossoms and myrtle, and around her neck, a Turkish diamond necklace and earrings, with Albert's sapphire brooch pinned at her breast. The ceremony itself was intimate compared to modern royal weddings, with only about 300 guests in attendance. Victoria's mother wept throughout the service, perhaps finally understanding that her daughter had truly escaped her control. Queen Adelaide, William IV's widow, attended with genuine warmth. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, and Victoria promised to love, honour, and obey her husband, despite being a reigning queen. That evening, Victoria wrote in her diary with passionate emotion, "I never spent such an evening," she recorded, her happiness evident in the capitalization and multiple exclamation points. "My dearest, dearest, dear Albert. His excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." She described their wedding night with uncharacteristic openness for Victorian England, making clear that their marriage was not just a political arrangement, but a genuine love match filled with physical passion. The early days of their marriage, however, were not without friction. Victoria was queen and reluctant to share her power, even with her beloved husband. Albert had no official role, no defined duties, no access to state papers. He was the Queen's husband, but he was not allowed to be her partner in governance. This frustrated Albert deeply. He was intelligent, well-educated, and politically astute, yet he was relegated to organizing Victoria's social calendar and standing beside her at official functions. Brushing the first crisis in their marriage came just months after the wedding. Albert wanted to be more than an ornament at Victoria's side. He wanted to help her, to share the burden of state business, to use his considerable talents in service of the crown. But Victoria, advised by Lord Melbourne, kept him at arm's length from political matters. They quarrelled, sometimes fiercely. Victoria's temper, inherited from the Hanoverian line, could be formidable, and Albert learned that his wife, for all her love, could be stubborn and willful. Everything changed with the arrival of children. Victoria gave birth to their first child, also named Victoria, on November 21st, 1840, just 9 months after the wedding. The Queen hated being pregnant, complained constantly about the discomfort, and dreaded childbirth. She later confided to her eldest daughter that she found babies frightful when undressed, and thought newborns resembled frogs. Yet children kept coming with regular frequency. Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, arrived in 1841, followed by Alice in 1843, Alfred in 1844, Helena in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, and finally Beatrice in 1857. Victoria became more dependent on Albert. She could not maintain her exhausting schedule of state duties while bearing and raising 9 children. Gradually, reluctantly, she began to share power with her husband. Albert started reading state papers with her, then advising on them, then managing much of the daily business of government on her behalf. By the mid-1840s, they worked side by side at matching desks, their heads bent together over documents, their partnership complete at last. Albert transformed himself from consort to co-ruler, and in the process, he transformed Britain. He championed education reform, the abolition of slavery, and the advancement of science and technology. He was fascinated by the Industrial Revolution that was reshaping the nation, and he saw an opportunity to showcase Britain's achievements to the world. The result was the Great Exhibition of 1851, Albert's crowning achievement and one of the defining moments of Victoria's reign. The exhibition was housed in the Crystal Palace, a revolutionary structure of glass and iron designed by Joseph Paxton. Built in Hyde Park, the palace covered 990,000 square feet and rose 108 feet high. Inside, over 100,000 exhibits from around the world displayed the wonders of the industrial age, from the Koh-i-Noor diamond to precision machinery, from fine arts to revolutionary inventions. Albert threw himself into planning the exhibition with passionate intensity. Many criticized him, calling the project a foolish waste of money that would end in disaster. But Albert persevered, and when the exhibition opened on May 1st, 1851, it was an unprecedented triumph. Over 6 million people visited during the 5 months it remained open, including visitors from every class of British society and tourists from around the world. The exhibition turned a profit of £186,000, money that was used to found the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. Victoria attended the opening ceremony with Albert and their children, and she recorded in her diary that it was one of the greatest and most glorious days of our lives. Watching her husband receive recognition for his vision and achievement, seeing the pride on his face as he surveyed what he had created, Victoria's love deepened into something beyond romance. She saw in Albert not just a husband, but a true partner, a man whose intelligence and dedication elevated the monarchy and served the nation with distinction. Their life together fell into a pattern of work and family. They purchased Osborne House on the Isle of Wight in 1845, creating a private seaside retreat where they could escape the formality of court life. Albert designed much of the house in an Italianate style, and there, Victoria could be simply a wife and mother, walking on the beach with her children, swimming from bathing machines, enjoying domestic happiness away from the public eye. Punished, in 1852, they acquired Balmoral Castle in Scotland, another private haven where Victoria developed her deep love for the Scottish Highlands. At Balmoral, Albert could hunt and fish, while Victoria sketched the landscape. They adopted Scottish traditions, wore tartan, and employed Scottish servants, creating a world apart from the rigid protocols of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. But even as their private life flourished, Victoria and Albert faced the harsh realities of ruling during a time of upheaval. The Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 devastated Ireland, killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to emigrate. Victoria and Albert donated generously to relief efforts and publicly supported aid programs, though critics argued the British government's response was inadequate. The Chartist movement demanded expanded voting rights and democratic reforms, bringing thousands of protesters to London's streets. The revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe, toppling monarchies and threatening the established order. Through it all, Victoria and Albert presented a united front. They became the embodiment of Victorian values, family stability, Christian devotion, and moral propriety. They popularized the Christmas tree tradition that Albert brought from Germany, and the image of the royal family gathered around a decorated tree became the ideal that middle-class Britain aspired to emulate. They championed public health reforms, supported hospitals and charities, and spoke out against the slave trade. Their marriage was not perfect. They quarreled regularly, sometimes explosively. Victoria's emotional volatility clashed with Albert's reserved Germanic nature. She demanded constant attention and affection, while he valued order and routine. Victoria wrote passionate letters begging for his love, while Albert wrote measured responses counseling moderation. After the birth of their 8th child, Leopold, in 1853, Albert wrote to a friend about Victoria's continuance of hysterics over what he called a miserable trifle, suggesting the strain that multiple pregnancies and the demands of monarchy placed on their relationship. Yet for all their differences, their love endured and deepened. Victoria relied on Albert completely, calling him her angel, her dear one, her lord and master. She deferred to his judgment in almost everything, from politics to child-rearing to the management of the royal household. Albert, in turn, devoted himself entirely to supporting Victoria and serving Britain. He worked tirelessly, often to the detriment of his health, managing state business, organizing royal ceremonies, advising ministers, and positioning the monarchy as a force for moral good in an age of rapid change. By 1860, Victoria and Albert had been married for 20 years. They had raised 9 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, a remarkable achievement in an era of high infant mortality. They had weathered political crises, foreign wars, and personal challenges. They had transformed the monarchy from an institution teetering on irrelevance into a symbol of national unity and family values. Victoria wrote to her uncle Leopold, expressing deep satisfaction with their marriage, noting that after 21 years, Albert was full of the same tender love of the very first days of our marriage. Neither could have imagined that within a year, death would shatter their partnership and plunge Victoria into decades of darkness. The golden years, an empire ascending. Reluctance. While Victoria and Albert built their private paradise, the world around them transformed at breathtaking speed. The Victorian era, as it came to be known, was a time of unprecedented change, progress, and expansion. Britain stood at the pinnacle of global power, its empire growing to encompass over 1/4 of the world's land mass and population. The sun, as the saying went, never set on the British Empire, for at any given moment, somewhere in Britain's vast colonial holdings, daylight reigned. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century, reached its full flowering during Victoria's reign. Britain became the world's first industrial nation, the workshop of the world, producing more manufactured goods than any other country. Factories sprouted across the Midlands and North. Railways crisscrossed the land, connecting cities and towns that had once been days apart by coach. Victoria made her first train journey in 1842, from Slough to Paddington, completing in minutes what would have taken hours by carriage. The railroad transformed not just transportation, but society itself, enabling people and goods to move with unprecedented speed and reshaping the very geography of daily life. Telegraph lines followed the railways, carrying messages across vast distances in seconds rather than days. In 1858, the first transatlantic telegraph cable was completed, connecting Britain to North America and shrinking the world in ways previous generations could never have imagined. Victoria sent the first official transatlantic telegram to President James Buchanan of the United States, a message that took 16 hours to transmit, but still represented a revolutionary leap in communication technology. Cities grew explosively as people poured in from the countryside, seeking work in factories and mills. London became the largest city in the world, a metropolis of vice and virtue, of grinding poverty and ostentatious wealth, of fog-shrouded streets and gaslit theatres. Charles Dickens captured the contradictions of Victorian London in his novels, depicting both the squalor of the slums and the vitality of city life. The Thames River, according to contemporary accounts, stank so terribly in the summer that Parliament had to drench curtains in chloride of lime to mask the smell. Yet this same river powered the industry that made Britain wealthy beyond measure. The Victorian age saw remarkable advances in science and medicine. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, revolutionizing understanding of life and humanity's place in nature, though the theory troubled Victoria, who found its implications disturbing. Anesthesia transformed surgery, and Victoria herself used chloroform during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853 and Princess Beatrice in 1857, despite opposition from clergy who argued that pain in childbirth was biblically ordained. By her use of chloroform, helped legitimize pain relief in childbirth for women across Britain. Joseph Lister pioneered antiseptic surgery, drastically reducing deaths from infection. Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory began to transform understanding of disease. Sanitation reforms, spurred by epidemics of cholera and typhoid, slowly began to improve public health in cities. Life expectancy rose, though infant mortality remained tragically high, and the poor still lived in conditions of appalling squalor. But alongside domestic progress came imperial expansion on a scale never before seen. Victoria presided over the greatest territorial expansion in British history. The empire grew through a combination of strategic calculation, commercial ambition, military conquest, and what Rudyard Kipling would later call the white man's burden, a paternalistic and racist ideology that justified colonialism as a civilizing mission. India was the jewel in the imperial crown, a vast subcontinent whose wealth and resources helped fuel British prosperity. The East India Company had effectively ruled India since the mid-18th century, but in 1857, a massive uprising known as the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, shook British control to its foundations. The rebellion began among Indian soldiers, or sepoys, in the company's army and spread across northern India. The violence was brutal on both sides, with massacres of British civilians and savage British reprisals. When the rebellion was finally suppressed in 1858, the British government took direct control of India from the East India Company. Victoria took a deep personal interest in India and its people. She learned Urdu, commissioned paintings of Indian scenes, and developed close relationships with several Indian servants, most famously Abdul Karim, whom she appointed as her munshi, or teacher. In 1876, on Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's recommendation, Parliament voted to grant Victoria the title Empress of India. The proclamation ceremony took place in Delhi on January 1, 1877, with Victoria's son, the Prince of Wales, representing her. Victoria was delighted with the new title, which she felt properly reflected her status as ruler of such a vast empire. In Africa, the scramble for territory intensified in the latter decades of Victoria's reign. Britain acquired or consolidated control over vast swathes of the continent, from Egypt in the north to South Africa at the southern tip, from the Gold Coast in the west to British East Africa on the Indian Ocean. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, became a vital strategic asset, and Britain purchased controlling shares in the Canal Company in 1875, securing the route to India. The expansion was not bloodless. Britain fought numerous colonial wars during Victoria's reign, conflicts often glossed over as little wars, despite their devastating impact on indigenous peoples. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 saw British forces initially defeated at the Battle of Isandlwana before overwhelming Zulu resistance. The Boer Wars in South Africa, particularly the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, proved far costlier than anticipated, with British forces resorting to concentration camps to suppress Boer resistance, camps where thousands of Boer civilians, including women and children, died from disease and malnutrition. Victoria took pride in Britain's imperial role, genuinely believing that British rule brought civilization, Christianity, and progress to peoples she considered less advanced. She supported missionary work, approved of efforts to suppress practices she deemed barbaric, such as sati in India, and saw herself as a benevolent ruler caring for her vast, diverse subjects. Modern historians recognize this view as deeply problematic, rooted in racial and cultural superiority. But it was a view widely shared in Victorian Britain, where imperialism was seen not just as an economic or strategic necessity, but as a moral duty. The empire brought tremendous wealth to Britain. Raw materials from the colonies, cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, gold and diamonds from South Africa, flowed into British ports and factories. British manufactured goods flowed out to captive colonial markets. The City of London became the world's financial centre. British banks and investors dominated global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Britain's navy ruled the waves, protecting trade routes and projecting power to every corner of the globe. Yet this golden age of empire and prosperity was built on exploitation and violence. In Ireland, the potato famine killed over 1 million people, while Ireland exported food to England. In India, famines killed millions more during Victoria's reign, even as India's wealth enriched Britain. In Africa, rubber plantations operated under conditions of brutal forced labor. Indigenous peoples across the empire saw their lands seized, their resources extracted, their cultures suppressed, and their autonomy destroyed. Victoria herself was not a simple villain in this story. She opposed slavery and supported the Royal Navy's efforts to suppress the slave trade. She took personal interest in the welfare of soldiers who fought in colonial wars, visiting hospitals and reviewing troops. She genuinely believed that British rule brought benefits to colonized peoples, however paternalistic and misguided that belief appears in hindsight. But she also presided over and celebrated an empire built on conquest and maintained by force, an empire whose legacy of exploitation and cultural destruction would haunt the 20th century and beyond. At home, Britain grappled with the contradictions of progress and poverty. While the middle class expanded and prospered, enjoying new consumer goods, better housing, and increased leisure time, the working class labored in dangerous factories, lived in overcrowded slums, and struggled to survive on meager wages. Children as young as 5 worked in coal mines and textile mills. Social reformers like Lord Shaftesbury fought for laws limiting working hours and improving conditions, achieving victories such as the Factory Acts that restricted child labor and mandated basic safety standards. The Second Reform Act of 1867 expanded the franchise, giving the vote to urban working-class men, though women and many rural workers remained disenfranchised. The growth of democracy and the emergence of mass politics gradually shifted power away from the aristocracy toward the middle class and eventually the working class, though this process would take decades to fully unfold. Victoria navigated these changes with varying degrees of comfort. She opposed women's suffrage despite being a powerful woman herself, believing that women's proper sphere was the home. She disliked trade unions and was suspicious of democratic reforms that threatened the established order. Yet, she also understood that the monarchy's survival depended on adapting to changing times, on maintaining popular support, on being seen as a force for stability and continuity, rather than reactionary opposition to progress. Through it all, through wars and reforms, through prosperity and crises, Victoria and Albert presented an image of moral rectitude and domestic harmony that became synonymous with the age. Victorian values, prudish sexuality, emphasis on hard work, Christian piety, and family devotion became the dominant ideology of the middle class, even if they were honored more in theory than practice. The Queen and Prince Consort were the living embodiment of these values, or so it seemed to a public that knew nothing of Victoria's passionate temperament or the quarrels that erupted in the palace. In 1861, as Victoria's third decade on the throne approached, Britain stood at the height of its power. The empire had never been larger or more secure. The economy boomed. Technology advanced at dizzying speed. The monarchy enjoyed widespread popularity. Victoria and Albert, though showing the strain of decades of work and worry, seemed destined to reign together for many years to come. But fate had other plans. Death, patient and implacable, was preparing to strike the blow that would shatter Victoria's world and plunge her into 4 decades of mourning that would define her later reign and transform her public image from vibrant queen to the eternal widow in black. The Shattering, Albert's death. The year 1861 began in mourning. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, had been ill for months, her health slowly failing. Victoria, who had spent so many years resenting her mother's role in the Kensington system, found herself reconciled with the Duchess in her final years. On March 16, 1861, the Duchess died with Victoria at her side. The Queen's grief was profound, mixed with guilt over the years of estrangement and the realization that her mother had genuinely loved her, however imperfectly she had shown it. Albert threw himself into comforting Victoria, taking on even more of her duties as she mourned. He was already overworked, stretched thin by decades of exhausting labor managing the Queen's affairs, advising on political matters, organizing charitable work, and raising their 9 children. He suffered from chronic stomach ailments and insomnia, pushing himself relentlessly despite his body's protests. In November 1861, Albert faced a crisis that drained what remained of his strength. The Prince of Wales, their eldest son Bertie, had been having an affair with an Irish actress named Nellie Clifton while training with the army at the Curragh camp in Ireland. News of the scandal reached Albert, who was horrified. He feared public disgrace, feared the damage to the monarchy's carefully cultivated moral image, and blamed himself for failing to instill proper values in his son. Despite feeling unwell, Albert travelled to Cambridge on November 25th to confront Bertie and discuss the situation. The journey exhausted him. He walked for hours in cold, damp weather, trying to talk sense into his son. When he returned to Windsor Castle, he was clearly ill, complaining of aches and pains, unable to sleep, increasingly unable to eat. The royal physicians, led by Dr. William Jenner, diagnosed typhoid fever, though modern medical historians have debated whether Albert actually suffered from typhoid or from complications of chronic conditions like Crohn's disease or cancer. Whatever the precise cause, Albert was dying, and everyone around him knew it, even if they could not quite bring themselves to believe it. Victoria nursed him devotedly through those final 2 weeks, sitting by his bedside, reading to him, arranging flowers in his room. Albert drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. He managed the affairs of state even from his sickbed, dictating revisions to a diplomatic dispatch concerning the Trent affair, a crisis with the United States during the American Civil War that threatened to drag Britain into the conflict. His changes helped diffuse the crisis, his last service to the nation he had adopted and served so faithfully. On December 14, 1861, Albert's condition deteriorated rapidly. Victoria refused to leave his side. Their children gathered throughout the day, knowing the end was near. Princess Alice, their second daughter, stayed constantly in the room, supporting her mother and father through the ordeal. At evening fell, Albert's breathing became increasingly laboured. The family gathered around his bed in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle. At 10:50 p.m., Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Prince Consort to Queen Victoria, died. He was 42 years old. Victoria threw herself across his body, calling his name, refusing to believe he was gone. Alice gently pulled her away, but Victoria returned again and again, kissing his forehead, holding his hand, unable to accept the reality that the man who had been her partner for 21 years, the love of her life, the father of her children, her advisor, her confidant, her everything, was gone forever. The sound that emerged from Victoria that night, a primal howl of anguish, echoed through Windsor Castle and was heard by servants and family members throughout the building. It was, witnesses said, not human sound, but something deeper, the cry of a soul torn apart. Princess Alice later wrote that she would never forget that sound, never forget her mother's face in that moment, never forget the way grief transformed Victoria from a living woman into something hollow and broken. The news spread across Britain with the speed of the telegraph Victoria and Albert had so championed. The nation, which had never fully warmed to the German prince during his life, now mourned him sincerely. Newspapers printed tributes, shops closed, churches held memorial services. Ordinary people wept in the streets, not just for the prince consort, but for their queen, whose grief was so evident, so total, so devastating. Victoria's immediate reaction was to shut down. She could not eat, she could not sleep, she could not function. For days she remained in a state of shock, wandering the rooms of Windsor Castle, touching Albert's things, smelling his clothes, refusing to believe he would not return. She blamed everyone, Bertie most of all, convinced that worry over their son's scandal had killed her beloved husband. "He was killed by that dreadful business," she said, and she would never fully forgive Bertie for what she believed was his role in Albert's death. Confiscated December 23rd, Albert's funeral took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Victoria did not attend. She could not bear to see his coffin lowered into the royal vault. Instead, she watched from a private gallery above, hidden from view, as her husband was laid temporarily to rest. She had already commissioned a magnificent mausoleum at Frogmore, where Albert would eventually be permanently entombed, and where she herself would one day lie beside him. In the weeks and months that followed, Victoria's grief hardened into something more than mourning. It became her identity, her purpose, her way of keeping Albert alive. She ordered that Albert's rooms in all the royal residences be kept exactly as they were the day he died. Fresh clothes were laid out for him every morning. Hot water was brought for his shaving. The bed was made with fresh linens. Photographs of Albert were placed throughout her rooms. She wore a locket with his portrait around her neck every day for the rest of her life. She began the practice of sleeping with Albert's nightshirt beside her pillow and keeping a plaster cast of his hand within reach. She commissioned countless memorials to him, the most famous being the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, a towering Gothic monument costing £120,000 that depicted Albert seated, holding the catalogue from the Great Exhibition, surrounded by allegorical figures and friezes celebrating the arts and sciences he had championed. Demographics the Royal Albert Hall as a monument to his love of music and the arts. She named buildings, streets, and institutions after him. She published books of his speeches and letters. She worked with his biographers to shape his image for posterity, insisting that he be remembered as a paragon of virtue and wisdom, a man without flaw or fault. But most significantly, Victoria withdrew from public life. She could not, would not, perform the ceremonial duties expected of a monarch. She refused to open Parliament in person, sending her speech to be read by the Lord Chancellor instead. She would not appear at state functions or social events. She retreated to Windsor Castle, to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, spending most of the year away from London, away from the public eye, hidden behind the walls of her private residences. The British people, initially sympathetic to their grieving queen, began to grow restless. 1 year of mourning was understandable. 2 years, perhaps excessive but forgivable. But as years stretched into a decade and Victoria remained in seclusion, criticism mounted. Political cartoons mocked the widow of Windsor. Republican sentiment, always present in Britain, grew stronger. Some asked what Britain was paying for if the Queen refused to be seen or to fulfill her public duties. Victoria was aware of the criticism, but she could not overcome her grief. She genuinely believed that without Albert, she could not function as a queen. How I, who leant on him for all and everything, without whom I did nothing, moved not a finger, arranged not a print or photograph, didn't put on a gown or bonnet if he didn't approve it, shall go on, to live, to move, to help myself in difficult moments, she wrote to her daughter. It was a genuine question, and for years she had no answer. Her appearance changed dramatically. Where once she had been a small but vibrant woman with a ready smile, she became stout and matronly, dressing always in black bombazine and silk, her face perpetually sad. She gained weight through comfort eating and lack of exercise, eventually reaching what some sources suggest was a 50-inch waist, a stark contrast to the slender girl who had danced until dawn in the early years of her reign. Punished that those around her join her in mourning. Her household wore mourning dress. The court observed mourning protocols for years. Anyone who showed too much cheer in her presence risked her displeasure. She created an atmosphere of perpetual gloom that wore down everyone around her, from her children to her ladies-in-waiting to her ministers. Her children suffered particularly. Victoria had never been an attentive mother, even when Albert was alive, too busy with affairs of state and too uncomfortable with young children. Now, in her grief, she became demanding and critical, particularly of her daughters, whom she expected to be constant companions in her mourning. Beatrice, her youngest, was not allowed to marry until she was 27, and then only on the condition that she and her husband live with Victoria and devote themselves to the Queen's care. Yet even in her darkest years of mourning, Victoria continued to perform her constitutional duties. She read state papers daily, met regularly with her prime ministers, and made decisions on matters of government policy. She maintained an extensive correspondence with relatives across Europe, with ministers, with military commanders. She was deeply involved in foreign policy, particularly concerning the Prussian-Danish conflicts and the Franco-Prussian War, where her family connections gave her unique insights and concerns. She developed close relationships with her servants, relationships that scandalized the court and provided her with emotional support. John Brown, a Scottish gillie who had served at Balmoral, became her constant companion in the years after Albert's death. Brown was gruff, plain-spoken, and utterly devoted to Victoria. He managed her household, accompanied her on outings, and spoke to her with a bluntness that no one else dared. Rumors swirled about the nature of their relationship, with some suggesting they had secretly married, though no evidence supports such claims. What is clear is that Victoria valued Brown's loyalty and found comfort in his presence during the darkest period of her life. When Brown died suddenly in 1883, Victoria was devastated once again. The best, the truest heart that ever beat, she called him. She commissioned a statue of him for Balmoral and wore a ring he had given her for the rest of her life. In her later years, another servant, Abdul Karim, became her close companion, teaching her Urdu and providing her with insights into Indian culture. The relationships with both Brown and Karim demonstrated Victoria's ability to transcend class barriers in her private life, even as she remained committed to rigid social hierarchies in public. Gradually, slowly, Victoria began to emerge from her seclusion, not because her grief had lessened, for it never truly did, but because political necessity and the entreaties of her family finally convinced her that the monarchy's survival required her presence. In 1871, her son Bertie fell seriously ill with typhoid, the same disease that had killed his father. The public rallied around the royal family, and when Bertie recovered, Victoria participated in a public Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral. The public response was enthusiastic, reminding Victoria of the affection her people still held for her. Benjamin Disraeli, who became Prime Minister in 1868 and again from 1874 to 1880, played a crucial role in coaxing Victoria back into public life. Unlike William Gladstone, who lectured Victoria and treated her with formal distance, Disraeli flattered her, consulted her, and made her feel valued and important. He called her the Fairy Queen, sent her flowers, wrote her gossipy letters, and made politics interesting rather than tedious. Victoria responded to his charm and attention, and under his influence, she gradually resumed more public duties. Disraeli convinced Victoria to take the title Empress of India in 1876, appealing to her pride and her genuine interest in the subcontinent. He supported her desire for more influence in foreign policy. He made her feel that her judgment and opinions mattered, that she was not just a figurehead, but an active participant in governing the vast empire. Victoria rewarded his devotion by becoming an enthusiastic supporter of his Conservative Party, much to the frustration of Gladstone and the Liberals. By the late 1870s, Victoria had achieved a kind of equilibrium. She remained in mourning dress for the rest of her life, continuing to sleep with Albert's nightshirt and to commemorate each anniversary of his death with private rituals. But she also resumed public appearances, opened buildings and monuments, reviewed troops, and participated in state ceremonies. She learned to function as a widow queen, carrying her grief like armor, but no longer letting it completely paralyze her. Porcelain, the years of seclusion, paradoxically, had not diminished the monarchy, but had in some ways strengthened it. By withdrawing from party politics and avoiding the social whirl of London, Victoria had elevated the crown above the partisan fray. She became a symbol of continuity and stability, a living link to the past, a grandmother figure who embodied the values and history of the nation. When she finally emerged more fully into public view in the 1880s and 1890s, it was as a beloved icon, the mother of the empire, an old woman who had endured tragedy with dignity and who now, in her golden years, represented all that was enduring and eternal about Britain. The reluctant return, rising from darkness. Seized, the 1870s marked a slow, painful emergence from the depths of grief. Victoria remained at Windsor, Balmoral, and Osborne for most of each year, managing affairs of state from her private residences while avoiding the ceremonial demands of London. Her prime ministers found themselves making the pilgrimage to Windsor for their regular audiences with the Queen, who preferred the comfort and control of her own spaces to the formality of Buckingham Palace. William Gladstone, who served as Prime Minister 4 times during Victoria's reign, found these audiences particularly trying. Gladstone was brilliant, passionate about reform, and deeply religious, but his earnest intensity grated on Victoria's nerves. He lectured her, she complained, treating her like a public meeting rather than a queen. He sent her endless memoranda running to dozens of pages when she wanted concise summaries. He was, in her view, pompous and verbose, lacking the personal touch that made governance bearable. Their clashes were legendary. Gladstone supported Irish Home Rule, which Victoria vehemently opposed. He wanted to reform the House of Lords, expand the franchise further, and pursue what Victoria saw as dangerously progressive policies. She made her displeasure clear in their meetings, questioning his judgment, challenging his proposals, and generally making his job more difficult. Gladstone, for his part, was frustrated by what he saw as Victoria's stubborn conservatism and her unwillingness to embrace necessary reforms. Benjamin Disraeli understood Victoria in ways Gladstone never could. Where Gladstone appealed to Victoria's reason, Disraeli appealed to her vanity and emotions. He wrote her flattering letters filled with political gossip and personal observations. He consulted her genuinely on policy matters, making her feel valued and important. He understood that she needed not just to be informed, but to be engaged, not just to receive decisions, but to feel she had influenced them. Disraeli's greatest gift to Victoria was the Empress of India title. When he proposed it in 1876, Victoria was delighted. She had long felt that Queen did not adequately reflect her status as ruler of the vast Indian subcontinent. Empress had a grandeur that suited her sense of dignity and importance. The Royal Titles Act passed through Parliament, not without controversy, as some saw it as an unnecessary piece of showmanship. But Victoria got her imperial crown and wore it proudly for the remaining 25 years of her reign. The title also reflected a broader shift in how Victoria saw herself and the monarchy. She was no longer just Britain's queen, but the mother of a global empire, a symbolic figure around whom diverse peoples could unite. She took her role as empress seriously, learning about Indian culture, corresponding with Indian princes, and developing genuine affection for some of her Indian subjects, even as she remained committed to the racial hierarchies and paternalistic attitudes that justified colonial rule. During these years, Victoria's relationships with her servants became crucial to her emotional survival. John Brown, the Scottish gillie who had entered her service in the 1860s, became her constant companion and protector. Brown was unlike anyone else in Victoria's life. He treated her with a rough familiarity that would have been unthinkable from a courtier, but which Victoria found comforting. He called her woman in his thick Scottish accent. He organized her daily routine, selected her ponies for riding, and managed her household with gruff efficiency. The court was scandalized. Rumors spread that Victoria and Brown were lovers, even secretly married. Newspapers mockingly called her Mrs. Brown. The royal family was mortified, particularly the Prince of Wales, who resented Brown's influence and what he saw as the man's presumptuous behavior. But Victoria was unmoved by the criticism. Brown was loyal, dependable, and made no demands on her emotions beyond service and companionship. In a world that had lost Albert, Brown provided stability. When Brown died suddenly in March 1883, Victoria was devastated. She planned to publish a memoir celebrating his life and devotion, but her family and advisors convinced her that such a publication would be unwise, given the already swirling rumors about their relationship. She had to content herself with private memorials, a statue at Balmoral, and a devoted entry in her journal mourning the loss of the best and truest friend I ever had. Abdul Karim entered Victoria's service in 1887, initially as a servant, but quickly becoming her munshi, or teacher. Karim taught Victoria Urdu and gave her insights into Indian culture and Muslim religion. She grew fond of him, promoted him to positions of responsibility, and defended him fiercely against the racism and resentment of her household and family, who objected to a servant, particularly an Indian servant, having such access and influence. Modern historians recognize that Victoria's relationships with Brown and Karim, while personally important to her, were also deeply problematic. Both men were in positions of dependence, unable to refuse the Queen or leave her service without consequences. The relationships, however genuine Victoria's affection, were inherently unequal. With Karim particularly, Victoria's fondness existed within a framework of imperial condescension. She saw him as a representative of a culture she considered inferior, even as she found him personally appealing and interesting. Through the 1870s and 1880s, Victoria slowly expanded her public role. She opened new buildings and monuments. She reviewed troops. She made occasional appearances in London. In 1871, when the Prince of Wales fell dangerously ill with typhoid, the same disease that had killed his father 10 years earlier, public sympathy for the royal family surged. Bertie's recovery was celebrated with a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, which Victoria attended. The enthusiastic crowds that greeted her reminded the Queen that her people still loved her, that they wanted to see her, that the monarchy remained popular despite her years of seclusion. In 1872, Victoria faced a direct challenge when a Republican movement gained traction in Britain. Inspired by the fall of Napoleon III in France and frustrated by Victoria's absence from public life, Republicans argued that the monarchy was an expensive anachronism that Britain could do without. They pointed to the Queen's large income from the civil list, the costs of maintaining multiple royal residences, and the apparent lack of value the nation received for its money. The Republican challenge actually helped Victoria by forcing her to recognize how precarious the monarchy's position had become. She began to appear more frequently in public, to perform more of the ceremonial duties she had abandoned, and to demonstrate that the crown was worth the expense. The Republicans never gained enough support to seriously threaten the monarchy, but the threat was real enough to scare Victoria and her advisors into action. As the years passed, Victoria's image transformed. The grieving widow became the enduring matriarch, the grandmother of Europe, a living link to a past that seemed more golden with each passing year. Her children and grandchildren married into virtually every royal house in Europe. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, eventually becoming Empress of Germany, though tragedy struck when Frederick died of throat cancer just 99 days after taking the throne. Her second son, Alfred, married the Grand Duchess Marie of Russia. Her granddaughter Alex married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Another granddaughter, Maud, became Queen of Norway. These dynastic connections gave Victoria influence across Europe and made family gatherings occasions of international diplomacy. They also meant that the coming catastrophe of World War I would be a family tragedy, with Victoria's grandchildren and their spouses ruling the warring nations. But in the 1880s and 1890s, these connections seemed to promise peace through kinship, a web of family relationships that would, it was hoped, prevent European wars. Victoria's political influence was real, though constrained by the evolving constitutional monarchy. She could not make policy, but she could advise, encourage, and warn. Her ministers had to brief her regularly, and while they were not obliged to follow her advice, they ignored her views at their peril. She had decades of experience, knowledge of European affairs through her family connections, and the moral authority that came with her long reign. In foreign policy particularly, Victoria exercised significant influence. She opposed what she saw as aggressive Russian expansion, supported Ottoman integrity as a bulwark against Russia, generally favored policies that maintained British imperial interests. She quarreled with Gladstone over his support for Irish Home Rule and his criticism of colonial policies. She worried about German ambitions under her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose erratic behavior and naval build-up concerned her even as she maintained affection for him as family. At home, Victoria remained conservative on most domestic issues. She opposed women's suffrage, despite being history's most powerful woman. She was skeptical of democratic reforms that expanded voting rights to the working class. She supported law and order, backed the police and military, and viewed strikes and labor unrest with suspicion. Yet she also supported practical reforms that improved working conditions, public health, and education, seeing these as necessary to maintain social stability and moral improvement. By the 1890s, Victoria had achieved a remarkable rehabilitation of her public image. The grieving widow, who had been criticized for her seclusion, was now celebrated as a living symbol of British greatness and continuity. As she approached her 60th year on the throne, plans began for celebrations that would showcase not just Victoria herself, but the empire she represented, the values she embodied, and the era that bore her name. The Grandmother of Europe, Power and Legacy. As Victoria entered her 8th decade, she was no longer simply Britain's monarch, but a living institution, a grandmother figure not just to her own vast family, but to the nation and empire. Her face, etched with wrinkles and usually set in a stern expression, was one of the most recognizable in the world. Photographs and portraits showed her dressed invariably in black, her white lace cap and veil marking her as the perpetual widow. But now, that image carried not sadness, but dignity, endurance, and continuity. Victoria's family had grown to astonishing proportions. Through her 9 children, she had 42 grandchildren, and would live to see several great-grandchildren. These descendants married into royal and noble families across Europe, creating a web of dynastic connections that earned Victoria the title Grandmother of Europe. Nearly every major European royal house had Victoria's blood flowing through its veins. The connections were both personal and political. Victoria corresponded regularly with her children and grandchildren across Europe, writing in a mixture of English and German, depending on the recipient. These letters were filled with family news, yes, but also with advice, warnings, and information about political developments. Victoria used her family connections to influence diplomatic relations, to warn of potential conflicts, and to promote British interests. Her relationship with her eldest grandson, Wilhelm II of Germany, was particularly complex and would have profound implications for the 20th century. Wilhelm's mother, Victoria's beloved daughter Vicky, had hoped to raise him with liberal British values. But Wilhelm, born with a withered arm and deeply insecure about his disability, rejected his mother's influence and embraced an aggressive German nationalism. He was erratic, bombastic, and often difficult, yet Victoria maintained affection for him even as she worried about his politics and his militaristic posturing. At the 1889 meeting at Osborne House, Victoria gathered an extraordinary collection of royalty. The future Edward VII of Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, all her descendants, all future antagonists in the Great War, sat together for a family photograph. Looking at that image now, knowing what would come, is to see tragedy foreshadowed in a family portrait. The Boer War, which began in 1899, cast a shadow over Victoria's final years. The conflict in South Africa between British forces and the Boer republics proved far more difficult than anticipated. British troops suffered humiliating early defeats. The war dragged on for 3 years, eventually requiring over 400,000 British troops to suppress Boer resistance. The British military's use of concentration camps to hold Boer civilians, where thousands died from disease and malnutrition, drew international criticism and moral condemnation. Victoria followed the war closely, reading reports, visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals, and sending messages of support to troops in the field. She wore regimental brooches to show solidarity with the army. When defeats came, she refused to accept despondency, insisting that British forces would ultimately prevail. When news arrived of the relief of Mafeking in May 1900, Victoria celebrated, joining in the national rejoicing even as she recognized the war's terrible cost. But the Boer War was merely one of many conflicts during Victoria's reign. Britain had fought wars almost continuously throughout her 63 years on the throne. The Crimean War against Russia, the Indian Rebellion, multiple Afghan wars, conflicts in China, campaigns across Africa, all had been waged under Victoria's name and authority. She took her role as head of the armed forces seriously, reviewing troops, awarding medals, and maintaining close relationships with military commanders. The Crimean War of 1853-1856 had been particularly significant in Victoria's life. It was the first major European war of her reign, and she took intense personal interest in it. She supported Florence Nightingale's reforms of military hospitals. She visited wounded soldiers, the first British monarch to do so since the Middle Ages. She instituted the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valour, personally designing the medal and insisting it be awarded to soldiers of all ranks, based on merit, not aristocratic privilege. The first Victoria Cross ceremony, held in Hyde Park in 1857, saw Victoria personally pin medals on soldiers' chests, including ordinary privates, a revolutionary act of egalitarianism that captured public imagination. Through all these conflicts and crises, Victoria proved herself remarkably resilient and dutiful. She read cabinet papers daily, met regularly with prime ministers, and maintained an exhausting correspondence on matters of state. Her memory was prodigious, and she could recall details of conversations and documents from years past. Ministers learned not to underestimate her or try to mislead her, as she would catch inconsistencies and challenge false statements. Victoria's relationships with her later prime ministers mellowed somewhat as she aged. She never warmed to Gladstone, but she developed respect for Lord Salisbury, the Conservative leader who served as Prime Minister for much of the 1880s and 1890s. Salisbury was cautious, conservative, and deferential to the Queen's opinions, making him far more congenial than the reform-minded Gladstone. The Queen's daily routine in her later years was rigorous and exhausting. She rose early, often before dawn, and immediately began work on her correspondence. She had breakfast sent to her room, eating while reviewing documents. She held audiences with ministers and officials throughout the day. She dictated letters and memoranda to her secretaries. She insisted on being informed of everything, from major policy decisions, minor court appointments, and woe to anyone who tried to keep information from her. She travelled regularly between her various residences, Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral, managing to conduct business from whichever location she occupied. The government adapted to her schedule, with ministers travelling to wherever she was staying for their audiences. Dispatch boxes followed her wherever she went, arriving daily by train and courier, ensuring she stayed connected to the machinery of government. In foreign policy, Victoria's influence was particularly pronounced in the 1880s and 1890s. She opposed Russian expansion, fearing it threatened British interests in India and the Mediterranean. She supported Ottoman integrity as a counterweight to Russian ambitions. She worried about French colonial competition in Africa. She maintained close surveillance of German military buildup under Wilhelm II. Her views were conservative and focused on preserving British imperial dominance, but they were informed by decades of experience and by intelligence gleaned from her family connections across Europe. Victoria also maintained an extensive network of personal relationships with writers, artists, scientists, and other public figures. She commissioned paintings from leading artists. She supported scientific institutions. She read voraciously, though her tastes ran more to biography and history than to novels, and she maintained correspondences with various literary figures. Poet laureate Alfred, Lord Tennyson, was a personal friend, and his poetry, celebrating British imperialism and Victorian values, found enthusiastic support from the Queen. Her homes reflected her interests and personality. Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, designed by Prince Albert in an Italianate style, was her favourite summer retreat. The house overlooked the Solent, reminding Albert of the Bay of Naples, and Victoria had created there a private paradise where she could relax away from formal court life. She had a bathing machine for swimming, rare for a woman of her age and status. She maintained extensive gardens and collected art and artifacts that reminded her of Albert. Balmoral Castle in Scotland was her autumn retreat, where she indulged her love of the Highlands that Albert had instilled in her. She adopted Scottish traditions, wore tartan, employed Scottish servants, and immersed herself in the romance of Highland culture. Critics mocked her Balmorality, seeing it as artificial and sentimental, but for Victoria, it represented connection to Albert and to a simpler, more natural world, away from the complications of politics and empire. Windsor Castle remained the centre of official life, where Victoria received ambassadors, held investitures, and managed the daily business of monarchy. The castle was filled with portraits of Albert, busts and statues of him, rooms maintained as they were when he lived. Victoria had created a shrine to Albert's memory, and Windsor was its temple. Through her later years, Victoria remained surprisingly active despite her age and increasing physical limitations. Rheumatism made walking difficult, and she often used a wheelchair for longer distances. Her eyesight dimmed with cataracts. She suffered from indigestion and various other ailments of old age. Yet she continued to fulfill her duties, to travel, to maintain her exhausting schedule of work and public appearances. She survived 7 assassination attempts during her reign, facing each with remarkable courage. The first attempt came in 1840, when Edward Oxford fired pistols at Victoria and the pregnant Queen while she rode in an open carriage with Prince Albert. The bullets missed, and Victoria, rather than hiding in terror, deliberately continued to ride in open carriages to show she would not be intimidated. Subsequent attempts over the years met the same resolute response. Victoria believed she was under divine protection, and that assassination attempts only strengthened public sympathy for the monarchy. By the mid-1890s, as Victoria approached 60 years on the throne, she had become more than just a monarch. She was a living symbol of an age, an era of progress and empire, of industry and expansion, of confidence and power. The Victorian era was not just named for her, but shaped by her presence, her values, and her endurance. As plans began for her Diamond Jubilee celebration in 1897, the challenge was how to celebrate not just a reign, but an entire epoch of British history. The Diamond Crown, 1897, Jubilee. On September 23, 1896, Queen Victoria surpassed her grandfather, George III, to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. She had been on the throne for 59 years, 3 months, and 2 days, longer than any of her predecessors. Victoria marked the occasion privately at Balmoral Castle, recording in her journal her gratitude for God's protection and her request that formal celebrations wait until June 1897, when she would complete 60 full years as Queen. Pioneered, the Diamond Jubilee, as it would be called, was to be unlike any celebration Britain had ever seen. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain proposed that it be not just a celebration of Victoria's reign, but a festival of the British Empire, showcasing the vast territories, diverse peoples, and immense power that made Britain the dominant global force. The Jubilee would display to the world that the sun never set on the British Empire, and that Victoria, in her 88th year, presided over a quarter of the world's population. Plans began immediately and on an epic scale. Prime ministers from all the self-governing colonies were invited to London. 11 colonial prime ministers eventually attended, bringing with them troops representing the empire's martial might. From Canada came mounted police and infantry. From Australia and New Zealand came contingents in their distinctive uniforms. From India came cavalry representing different regiments and princely states. From Africa came soldiers from various colonies. The assembly represented every continent where the British flag flew. Victoria herself was deeply involved in planning, insisting on certain elements and vetoing others. She wanted the celebration to be grand, but not exhausting for her. She was nearly 78 years old, increasingly frail, and could not manage extended ceremonies or travel. Plans had to accommodate her physical limitations while still providing the spectacle the occasion demanded. The actual anniversary of Victoria's accession, June 20, 1897, was marked with a private Thanksgiving service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Victoria wore black, as always, but she added diamonds and the insignia of the Order of the Garter, giving her mourning attire a festive sparkle. She prayed for guidance and reflected on the extraordinary 6 decades of her reign. "This eventful day, 1897, has opened," she wrote, "and I pray God to help and protect me as he has hitherto done these 60 long, eventful years." The main public celebration was scheduled for June 22nd, declared a bank holiday across the empire. London prepared for weeks. Buildings were festooned with bunting, flags and decorations in red, white and blue. Shops displayed Jubilee souvenirs, mugs, plates, flags, medals, and every conceivable commemorative item. Grandstands were erected along the processional route, with seats sold to benefit charity. Rooftops and balconies along the route commanded premium prices as people sought vantage points to see the Queen. 3 million visitors came to London for the Jubilee, overwhelming the city's hotels and lodgings. Thousands camped in Hyde Park, where 25,000 colonial soldiers had set up a vast tent city. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Street vendors hawked their wares, bands played on every corner. The normally reserved British public allowed themselves to be swept up in a carnival atmosphere unlike anything the city had seen. The morning of June 22nd dawned grey and overcast, threatening rain. But as the hour of the procession approached, the clouds parted and sunlight flooded London's streets, which many took as a sign of divine favour. At 11:15 a.m., a cannon fired in Hyde Park, signalling that Victoria had departed Buckingham Palace. Cheers erupted along the entire 6-mile route as word spread that the Queen was coming. Victoria rode in an open landau carriage, flanked by outriders and surrounded by a glittering escort of cavalry. Despite the bright day, she wore her customary black dress, but it was embellished with silver and grey details, and she wore a bonnet decorated with white flowers and diamonds. She carried a parasol to shade herself from the sun and a bouquet of orchids. Her face, careworn and elderly, showed the strain of her years, but also a kind of transcendent joy as she witnessed the extraordinary outpouring of affection from her people. The procession was magnificent beyond description. 17 carriages carried the royal family and visiting dignitaries. The colonial prime ministers rode in open carriages, with Canada's Wilfrid Laurier, recently knighted by Victoria, receiving particularly enthusiastic cheers. The military escort included cavalry from across the empire, their varied uniforms and weapons a visual representation of Britain's global reach. The crowds were unprecedented. Every available spot along the route was packed with people. They hung from windows, crowded onto rooftops, climbed lampposts and trees, anything to catch a glimpse of their Queen. Many had waited for days to secure good positions. The cheering as Victoria passed was described as deafening, a roar of love and loyalty that swept through the streets like a physical force. At St. Paul's Cathedral, a brief service was held outside the building. Victoria, unable to manage the steep steps, remained in her carriage while the Archbishop of Canterbury led prayers and a choir sang Te Deum. The moment was captured in countless photographs and paintings, showing the elderly Queen in her carriage, surrounded by prelates and nobles, with the massive dome of St. Paul's rising behind her. Confiscated between the service began, Victoria sent a telegram to her empire. The message was brief but heartfelt. "From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them. VR and I." The I stood for Imperatrix, Empress, her title as ruler of India. The telegram was transmitted around the world, reaching every corner of the empire, via the network of telegraph cables that linked Britain to its far-flung territories. The procession continued through the City of London, across London Bridge, through South London, and back across Westminster Bridge to Buckingham Palace. Everywhere, the scenes were the same. Delirious crowds, waving flags, thrown flowers, tears of joy and patriotic fervour. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views. Women waved handkerchiefs, men doffed their hats and cheered until their voices gave out. Victoria was deeply moved. She wrote in her journal that evening, "A never-to-be-forgotten day. No one ever, I believe, has met with such an ovation as was given to me, passing through those 6 miles of streets. The crowds were quite indescribable, and their enthusiasm truly marvellous and deeply touching. The cheering was quite deafening, and every face seemed to be filled with real joy. I was much moved and gratified." The celebrations continued for weeks. There were garden parties at Buckingham Palace, a state banquet for visiting dignitaries, military reviews, illuminations, and fireworks. Fountains and monuments were erected across Britain to commemorate the Jubilee. The Jubilee Tower was built on the moors above Darwin in Lancashire. The Cunningham Clock Tower was erected in Peshawar on the northwest frontier of India. Cities and towns across the empire held their own celebrations, from Toronto to Sydney to Cape Town to Bombay. Blazing worship special verses in Victoria's honour. Alfred Austin, the poet laureate, composed an ode. Rudyard Kipling wrote Recessional, a poem that, while celebratory of empire, also carried notes of warning about pride and the impermanence of earthly power. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday, Kipling wrote, is one with Nineveh and Tyre. It was a reminder that empires fall, that glory fades, that even Victoria's long reign would one day end. The Jubilee was, in many ways, the high watermark of British imperialism and Victorian confidence. Britain controlled more territory than any empire in history. British industry, though beginning to face competition from Germany and the United States, still dominated world manufacturing. British finance controlled global capital flows. The Royal Navy ruled the seas without serious challenge. British culture, literature, and values spread across the globe, carried by missionaries, merchants, soldiers, and settlers. Yet even in that moment of triumph, cracks were visible to those who looked closely. The Boer War would soon reveal the costs and challenges of maintaining empire. Economic competition from rising powers threatened Britain's industrial dominance. Social unrest at home challenged Victorian certainties. The arms race and alliance systems that would lead to World War I were already forming. Victoria's grandchildren, ruling various European nations, would soon face each other across trenches in the catastrophic conflict that would shatter the old order. But in June 1897, those shadows lay in the future. For that golden moment, Britain celebrated itself, its queen, and its empire with uninhibited joy. Victoria, the girl who had ascended the throne at 18, the young woman who had fallen in love with a German prince, the widow who had mourned for decades, had become the embodiment of an age. She was Britain, and Britain was hers, and together they stood at the zenith of power and glory. Punished as Victoria returned to Windsor after the celebrations, exhausted but deeply satisfied, she could look back on 60 years of reign with justified pride. She had survived tragedy and triumph. She had endured. She had prevailed. She was the longest reigning monarch Britain had ever known, and her empire was the greatest the world had ever seen. She did not know that she had less than 4 years remaining, that her death would mark not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, that the 20th century would sweep away much of what she had built. All she knew, in that summer of 1897, was that she had done her duty, that her people loved her, and that she had made Albert proud. That was enough. The final chapter, Death of an Era. Paralyzed. The year 1900 was, in Victoria's own words, a horrible year, nothing but sadness and horrors of one kind and another. The Boer War, which many had expected to be a quick victory, dragged on with mounting British casualties and international criticism. In July, her son Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, died of throat cancer at age 55. In October, her grandson, Prince Christian Victor of Schleswig-Holstein, died of malaria while serving in South Africa. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, Empress Frederick of Germany, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer of the spine, adding to Victoria's anguish. On Christmas Day 1900, Victoria's close friend Jane Churchill, Baroness Churchill, died in her sleep at Osborne House while visiting the Queen. The loss devastated Victoria, who had already suffered so much grief that year. Her large appetite, which had sustained her through decades of work and worry, disappeared. She ate almost nothing, just tiny portions of boiled chicken or beef, losing weight rapidly until she appeared, according to observers, about one-half the person she had been. Victoria spent Christmas at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, as was her custom. The house, designed by Prince Albert and filled with memories of their happy times together, was her favourite residence. But this Christmas was sombre. Victoria was clearly failing, though she tried to maintain her routine and her duties. She read state papers, signed documents, and saw visitors, but the effort exhausted her. On January 6, 1901, Dr. James Reed, Victoria's physician of 20 years, noted that the Queen was experiencing ups and downs, becoming easily tired and falling into a nervous, depressed, hopeless state when exhausted. She was eating and sleeping poorly. Her legs, crippled by rheumatism, could barely support her weight. Her eyesight, clouded by cataracts, was failing. She wrote in her journal on January 4th, "From not having been well, I see so badly, which is very tiresome." On January 13th, Victoria made her last diary entry. The entry was brief and routine. Had a fair night, but was a little wakeful. Got up earlier and had some milk. Lenchen came and read some papers. Out before 1, in the garden chair, Lenchen and Beatrice going with me. Rested a little, had some food, and took a short drive with Lenchen and Beatrice. Rested when I came in, and at 5:30 went down to the drawing room, where a short service was held by Mr. Clement Smith, who performed it so well, and it was a great comfort to me. Rested again afterwards, then did some signing and dictated to Lenchen. It was the end of a diary that had been kept faithfully for most of Victoria's life, an extraordinary record spanning more than 6 decades, documenting the reign of Britain's longest-serving monarch. The diary would eventually run to millions of words, much of it later destroyed by Victoria's daughter Beatrice in her role as literary executor, but enough survived to provide intimate glimpses of Victoria's thoughts, feelings, and daily life. On January 16th, Victoria's condition worsened dramatically. Dr. Reed noted that she was very drowsy all forenoon and disinclined to get up. It was the first time in 20 years that Reed had seen the Queen in bed during the day. The end was approaching, though no one yet wanted to acknowledge it. The royal family began to gather. The Prince of Wales, Victoria's son Bertie, rushed to Osborne from London. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's eldest grandson, travelled from Germany. Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and George, Duke of York, the future George V, arrived. Victoria's daughters, who had been with her throughout, prepared themselves for what was coming. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness. When briefly lucid, she asked Reed, "Am I better at all?" Reed, unable to give her false hope, simply said, "Yes," and Victoria made one last request. "Then can I have Turi?" Turi was her favourite Pomeranian, and the little dog was brought to her bed, where Victoria held him for about an hour, drawing comfort from his warm presence. On January 22nd, 1901, the end came. Dawn broke grey and windy over the Isle of Wight. Victoria had passed a difficult night, her breathing laboured, her lungs filling with fluid. At 8 a.m., a public bulletin was issued. "The Queen this morning shows signs of diminishing strength, and Her Majesty's condition again assumes a more serious aspect." At 9:30 a.m., it seemed the end was near. The royal family rushed to Victoria's first-floor bedroom, congregating around the small, temporary bed where she lay, moved there from her larger bed to make nursing easier. At 4 p.m., another bulletin was issued, stark in its simplicity. "The Queen is slowly sinking." As darkness fell on the Isle of Wight, the family gathered once more in Victoria's room. The Prince of Wales sat at her right side, Princess Alexandra at her left. Princesses Helena and Beatrice stood at the foot of the bed. Princess Louise knelt on the floor. Other family members found spaces around the room. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson but also German emperor, stood with Dr. Reed, the two men supporting Victoria's body with their arms to help her breathe more easily. Bishop Davidson began reciting prayers. People murmured their names, as if to help Victoria recognize them one last time. Her eyes moved to the right and upward, toward a large painting of Christ on the wall. A look of calm seemed to pass over her face. Her breathing became more labored, more irregular, and then, at 6:30 p.m., it stopped. Queen Victoria, monarch of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, was dead at age 81. She had reigned for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days. Most of her subjects had never known another monarch. Britain, the empire, the world itself, seemed to hold its breath in shock and disbelief. Negligence spread rapidly via telegraph. Newspapers across Britain published special editions. Shops closed and draped their windows in black. Church bells tolled. People wept openly in the streets. "God help us," was the common refrain. How could Britain continue without Victoria? Who would guide the nation? What would become of the empire? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying. The Prince of Wales became King Edward VII at the moment of his mother's death. He had waited 59 years to ascend the throne, longer than any heir in British history. Victoria had never given him real responsibility or power, keeping him at arm's length, still blaming him for the scandal that she believed had killed Prince Albert 40 years earlier. Now, at age 59, he was king, facing the enormous task of following Britain's longest reigning monarch. At Osborne House, Victoria's body was prepared according to her detailed instructions. She had planned her own funeral meticulously, leaving a list of items to be placed in her coffin. She was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil, symbolizing her reunion with Albert. Around her neck was placed Albert's dressing gown. A plaster cast of Albert's hand was positioned beside her. But Victoria had also left secret instructions for Dr. Reed, instructions that only he and a trusted nurse carried out. In Victoria's left hand, concealed from the family by a carefully positioned bunch of flowers, was placed a photograph and lock of hair from John Brown, her devoted Scottish servant who had died 18 years earlier. On her finger was Brown's mother's wedding ring, which Brown had given Victoria in 1883. Victoria had loved Albert, but she had also loved Brown, and she would take that love with her to the grave. On January 25th, Victoria's body was placed in the coffin by King Edward VII, German Emperor Wilhelm II, and Prince Arthur. The coffin was then displayed in Osborne House's dining room, where the household and invited guests could pay their respects. Flowers covered every surface. Photographs show the coffin surrounded by wreaths, palms, and elaborate floral tributes. Victoria had insisted on a white funeral, not the traditional black. Her coffin was draped with a white pall embroidered with gold. The funeral was to be military, befitting what she called a soldier's daughter, and the procession would be led by troops rather than the traditional gathering of peers and judges. It was Victoria asserting her will even in death, shaping her own remembrance. On February 1st, Victoria's coffin left Osborne House. It was carried by horse-drawn gun carriage to the pier at Cowes, then loaded onto the royal yacht Alberta for the crossing to the mainland. The sight was extraordinary and unprecedented. The entire British fleet, gathered in the Solent, stood at attention as the Alberta passed. As the yacht carrying Victoria's coffin moved between the lines of warships, minute guns fired in salute, booming, echoing across the water. Behind the Alberta came a flotilla of yachts carrying King Edward VII, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and other mourners, an armada escorting its dead queen home. At Portsmouth, Victoria's coffin was transferred to a train for the journey to London. From Victoria Station, it was carried by gun carriage through the streets to Paddington Station, where another train waited to transport it to Windsor. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets, standing in silence as the funeral cortege passed. Men removed their hats, women wept. The only sounds were the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the rumble of gun carriage wheels on pavement, and the muffled sobs of the mourning crowd. On February 2nd, the funeral service took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. It was the first state funeral of a reigning monarch in 64 years, since William IV. Kings, queens, princes, and representatives from every nation in Europe and beyond attended. The chapel was too small to accommodate everyone, so only the most important guests were admitted. The service was solemn and traditional, with hymns Victoria had selected herself. The Bishop of Winchester delivered the eulogy, speaking of Victoria's devotion to duty, her long reign, her impact on the nation and empire. But perhaps the most moving moment came when the coffin was borne from the chapel by 8 Grenadier Guards, watched by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, spanning 4 generations of the royal family. Later that evening, in a private ceremony, Victoria's coffin was carried to the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, the building she had commissioned for Prince Albert 40 years earlier. She was placed in the sarcophagus beside him, reunited at last with the love of her life. The inscription on the mausoleum had been carved decades earlier, Vale desideratissime, farewell, most beloved. Now both husband and wife rested there together, as Victoria had always intended. The Immortal Legacy. Injecting. Queen Victoria's death marked the end of more than a life, or even a reign. It marked the end of an era, a way of life, a set of certainties that had seemed eternal, but proved as mortal as the woman who embodied them. The 20th century, which had begun just 22 days before Victoria's death, would be defined by the demolition of the Victorian world she had represented. But Victoria's legacy endured, complex and contradictory, inspiring and troubling, undeniable in its impact. She had ruled longer than any British monarch before her, a record that would stand until her great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, surpassed it in 2015. During her 63 years on the throne, Britain had been transformed beyond recognition. The nation she inherited in 1837 was still largely agricultural, dominated by aristocratic landowners, with limited democratic rights. The nation she left in 1901 was the world's leading industrial power, with an expanding middle class, a growing labor movement, and democratic reforms that had enfranchised most adult men. The British Empire had reached its greatest extent under Victoria. At her death, Britain controlled over 1/4 of the world's land surface and governed more than 450 million people, representing nearly 1/4 of global population. The empire was a source of enormous pride to Victorians, who saw it as evidence of Britain's superiority and a force for civilization and progress. To the colonized peoples, however, it meant exploitation, cultural destruction, and oppression. The empire's legacy remains deeply contested, its crimes and its achievements both undeniable and impossible to easily balance. Vibhunicata's personal influence on the monarchy was profound. She transformed the crown from a political actor to a symbol of national unity and continuity. She demonstrated that a constitutional monarch could wield influence through consultation, advice, and moral authority, rather than through direct political power. She made the royal family the model of domestic virtue and family values, even if the reality was more complicated than the public image. She made the monarchy popular again after the scandals and unpopularity of her Hanoverian predecessors. Colonization Shendance shaped 20th century European history in ways she never could have anticipated. Through her children's and grandchildren's marriages, her blood flowed through virtually every European royal house. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who led his nation into World War I, was her grandson. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, murdered with his family in the Russian Revolution, was married to her granddaughter. King George V of Britain, who ruled during the Great War and its aftermath, was her grandson. The catastrophic war that tore Europe apart in 1914 was, in a sense, a family quarrel among Victoria's descendants, though the causes ran far deeper than family connections. Victoria's personal life left a complicated legacy. Her love for Prince Albert was genuine and profound, but her 40 years of mourning also kept her from fully embracing her role as queen for much of her reign. Her relationships with John Brown and Abdul Karim revealed a capacity for crossing class and racial boundaries in her private life. But these relationships were also problematic, existing within structures of power and dependence that made true equality impossible. As a woman, Victoria's legacy is particularly complex. She was one of history's most powerful women, yet she opposed women's rights and suffrage. She reigned in an era named for her, yet the Victorian age was characterized by rigid gender roles and limitations on women's legal rights and opportunities. She proved that a woman could rule effectively, yet she insisted that women were unsuited for public life and political participation. The contradiction is striking, though perhaps not surprising given the social context in which she lived. Victoria's 9 children and 42 grandchildren ensured her biological legacy, but her descendants faced challenges in the 20th century. World War I destroyed several European monarchies, including the German and Russian empires. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 killed millions. The economic disasters of the 1920s and 1930s, the rise of fascism and communism, World War II, the Holocaust, and the decolonization of the British Empire all represented fundamental challenges to, or rejections of, the Victorian world order. Yet the monarchy Victoria shaped survived and even thrived. Her son Edward VII, despite his mother's doubts, proved an effective king, using his diplomatic skills to strengthen Britain's alliances. Her grandson George V successfully navigated Britain through World War I and adapted the monarchy to democratic pressures, changing the royal house's name from the German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the English Windsor. Her great-great-granddaughter Elizabeth II became Britain's longest reigning monarch, eventually surpassing even Victoria's record, and demonstrated that the institution Victoria had helped modernize could endure into the 21st century. Breaking the Victorian era's cultural legacy remains powerful. Victorian literature, from the novels of Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters to the poetry of Tennyson and Browning, continues to be read and studied. Victorian architecture, from the Gothic revival to the distinctive industrial buildings, shapes Britain's physical landscape. Victorian social reforms, from public health measures to education systems, laid the foundations for the modern welfare state. Victorian scientific advances, from Darwin's theory of evolution to advances in medicine and engineering, transformed human understanding of the world. But the Victorian era's darker legacies also endure. The racial theories that justified imperialism influenced 20th century racism and colonialism. The rigid class system and industrial exploitation left scars that persisted for generations. The sexual repression and double standards of Victorian morality created psychological damage that took decades to overcome. The environmental destruction of unchecked industrial expansion created problems we still grapple with today. Victoria herself remains a figure of endless fascination. Biographers have written dozens of lives of the Queen, each generation finding new aspects of her character and reign to explore. She has been portrayed in countless films, television series, and plays, from the earnest young queen of The Young Victoria to the elderly widow of Mrs. Brown, from the passionate lover of Albert to the complex, flawed human being revealed in her letters and journals. What emerges from all these portrayals is a woman of remarkable strength and resilience who faced tragedy with dignity and ruled with dedication. She was not perfect. She was stubborn, sometimes small-minded, capable of holding grudges for decades. She had blind spots about class, race, and gender. She mourned excessively and withdrew from public duty when her country needed visible leadership. She was complicit in an imperial project that brought suffering to millions. But she was also capable of deep love, genuine compassion, and loyal friendship. She worked tirelessly throughout her long life, managing the business of state even in her 80s. She survived assassination attempts with courage, personal tragedies with resilience, and political crises with determination. She adapted to changes that would have overwhelmed lesser individuals. She proved that a woman could rule one of the world's greatest empires, even if she could never quite reconcile that fact with her belief in traditional gender roles. When Victoria died, the world mourned not just a queen, but an epoch. The certainties of the Victorian age, the confidence in progress, the belief in Britain's imperial destiny, the faith in tradition and continuity, all these seemed to die with her. The 20th century would prove far more violent, chaotic, and uncertain than the Victorians had imagined possible. Yet Victoria's legacy endures. The monarchy she modernized continues. The Commonwealth of Nations that evolved from her empire maintains connections, however attenuated, between Britain and its former colonies. The values she embodied, duty, service, family, faith, remain powerful ideals even for those who question or reject them. The age that bears her name remains a touchstone for understanding the roots of the modern world. In the end, Victoria was a woman who lived 81 years, loved deeply, suffered profoundly, worked unceasingly, and reigned longer than any of her predecessors. She was born when Napoleon still haunted European nightmares, and died when the 20th century's catastrophes were already taking shape. She witnessed the Industrial Revolution transform society, the telegraph and telephone revolutionize communication, the railway shrink distances, and the British Empire expand to unprecedented scope. She was the queen who became an empress, the young woman who became the widow of Windsor, the grieving bride who became the grandmother of Europe. She was Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, and the woman who shaped an era. Her life was the story of the 19th century, and her legacy, for better and worse, shapes our world still. Plunge on her death, the great imperial edifice she represented seemed eternal, the British Empire stretching across the globe, the Victorian values she embodied seemingly unshakable. But empires crumble, eras end, certainties dissolve. What remains is the human story, a young woman who became a queen, who loved and lost, who endured and prevailed, who reigned through triumph and tragedy, and who, when her extraordinary life finally ended, left behind a world transformed by her presence upon it. From the Kensington Palace where she was born, to the mausoleum at Frogmore where she was laid to rest beside Albert. From the uncertain child who learned she would be queen, to the confident monarch who became the longest reigning sovereign in British history, Victoria's journey was nothing short of epic. It was a life that encompassed the extremes of human experience, soaring joy and crushing grief, absolute power and aching vulnerability, public adulation and private sorrow. All, through 63 years on the throne, through 9 children and 42 grandchildren, through the expansion of empire and the transformation of Britain, through wars and reforms, through love and loss, Victoria endured. She did her duty. She kept faith with the promise she had made as a 10-year-old girl learning her destiny. I will be good. Pensions. She was good, in the sense she meant it, dedicated to duty, devoted to country, faithful to the crown. Whether she was good in any moral, absolute sense, history continues to debate. But she was undeniably great, in the sense that her life had vast impact, that her reign shaped nations and influenced millions, that her era bore her name and continues to echo through time. When the aged queen breathed her last on that winter evening at Osborne House, surrounded by the descendants of her great love and listening to prayers that promised eternal rest, an era ended. The Victorian age was over. The 20th century had begun. The world would never be quite the same. But Victoria's legacy lives on, in the monarchy she modernized, in the empire that bore her name, in the values she embodied, and in the extraordinary story of a woman who was born to be queen and who reigned, for better and for worse, over one of history's greatest powers during one of history's most transformative eras. She was Victoria. She was the queen who became an empress, the girl who became a legend, the woman who shaped the world. And her story, like the era that bears her name, remains eternal.